Assalamu alaikum. Today we are going to look at a little bit more about structuralism. Before I begin, I would like to ask you to kindly bear with me since I don't have my PC and I'm just working over a phone and a copy of Peter Barry's beginning theory. All right. In our last class, we saw how language acted as an arbitrary entity and how it was constitutive and it was also relational. Now, when we think of all those things, we had a couple of examples to work with. First of all, we worked on how language, whatever meanings we accorded a word, was purely arbitrary. There was no sense behind it. And we also saw how every word could be understood only in relation to another word. And then we saw how language itself made up realities instead of just reflecting it, right? Peter Parry suggested a few examples for us to work out with, and he also asks us to stop and think a little bit. I request you all to go through this in your own independent time, and you can treat it as an assignment for today and work on this. See, first of all, he says, can you think of other examples? Let me get the highlighter here. Yeah. Okay. Can you think of other examples of language constituting reality rather than merely naming something which is already there? Your examples may be of a similar type to those mentioned above. As in, we spoke about freedom fighter, and okay, I did not mention the poll tax. Actually, poll tax is something, a tax laid down by a certain government, which was according to the inclination, political inclination of the person, would use be treated in a different manner. Say, for instance, the anti-government, okay, the opposing party would call it a poll tax, while the ruling party would call it community charges, whereas both refer to the same action, right? It is purely relational. And we also saw how seasons are considered. Seasons, we are making up those seasons, whereas the year runs throughout. There are no distinct divisions between each season, right? So, in that sense, there is also, Peter Barry makes mention of a train leaving from probably Geneva at 8:25. That train would be called merely 8:25. Yeah. So the one leaving at 8:25 would imply that there is a train leaving from a certain point, going towards a certain point at a particular time. So he says, see how he works out these examples. He says, if, say, for instance, the train is not working at that particular moment, and instead of it, another train, okay, another train carrying another set of passengers, they are going about, how would that feel for you? Now, does this make sense for you? Because we are not talking about one particular train or one particular train that leaves at a particular time. In fact, it is even possible that this train may not even leave at 8:25. It could leave about, say, it may be half an hour late, or maybe even 6 hours late, or it may not even go on that day and leave at another time, say the very next day. Or it may not even make the stop that is required to stop. So how would you call it an 8:25? This could quite possibly happen. So you see, we see the world, we see through the medium of language. Now, language itself is just a lens, merely a lens. Now, let me just put this highlighter off because it is messing up my work. So Peter Barry suggests quite a few examples here. Firstly, can you think of other examples? Like we have already spoke about the seasons, the colors, a particular train, a poll tax, and the perception according to the political party we are inclined in. Now, he says, why don't you look for your own examples? You will come up with plenty of those yourself. Now, this will be your assignment for today. Firstly, can you think of other examples of language constituting reality rather than merely naming something which is already there? Your examples may be of a similar type to those mentioned above: freedom fighter, poll tax, the seasons. You may also like to consider the significance in this context of those speech acts. you know, as in we are talking here about the performatives, as in, say for instance, you're making a promise, okay? You are promising someone something. Now, that something may or may not turn into a reality. But how do we know that so and so thing is going to happen at all? You are taking an active part through language to create a certain set of reality. So consider all those probabilities, the of performatives actually. Okay. Now this will itself constitute a certain reality you may use through bring about through language. Now, secondly, can you see any flaws in the line of argument about language in reality put forward by Saussure? For instance, does it make sense to posit a category of pure difference? See, Saussure keeps speaking about language being made up of merely differences. Now, yes, language is merely made up of differences. That is an argument that Saussure posits. But how far is it real? How far is it true? Now, there is this Christopher Ricks, Christopher Ricks, who came up with a counter view that, that says you can't just have difference, you have to have difference between things. Okay? You cannot merely have differences. Language cannot exist only through differences. It has to have differences between fixed concepts. Okay? Now, when you look at his Saussure's theory like this, you would have to accept Rick's argument and agree that you can only have differences between things. And if it is something that you agree upon, you would have to wonder what implication this would have for the Saussurean argument that languages have only differences without fixed terms. Think about it. Also, thirdly, are you convinced by the train? So another argument, again, see, Peter Barry presents Saussure's argument. At the same time, he is playing the devil's advocate, asking you to rethink the theory that you've just been posited. Okay? You've been presented with a view that whatever train that leaves at 8:25 from Geneva is, irrespective of what time it leaves, irrespective of what station it leaves from, is going to mean a certain thing in everyone's mind. The word itself has created a certain general specific image, not general but specific image. Now, again, Peter Barry is asking you, really, are you convinced by this train? Why? Because, see, is its position in the timetable really the only thing which it gives its identity? Because there are so many concepts that go into it. I mean, critical components that go into the making of a train. The kind of passengers. For instance, consider it is something that carries goods instead of passengers. Now think about a flock of birds. Now we'll come to that now. See, he says a counter argument may be that 8:25 has to be train like before it can be 8:25. Nobody will remark, there goes the 8:25 to Paris. If a flock of pigeons, a flock of pigeons from under the station canopy. Likewise, it is true to say that a given street has a largely relational identity. You define X street by saying that it is the one that runs at right angles between Y and Z street. All the same, a piece of string stretched between the two will not be mistaken for a street. See? You cannot call something that leaves from a certain place at 8:25, there goes the 8:25. You would call it birds. So just merely the time in which a certain train leaves cannot be the whole concept. Okay, we are now closely bordering towards metonymy here. Okay. And again, work out this example as well. See, think about it. There is a street, X street, between Y and Z street. Now, this you won't call this X street mainly because of its position, because it lies somewhere between X and Y. Instead of, an X, there being a street, if there is a string running along from Y to Z, you wouldn't call that string a street. The street is not merely composed of its position alone. It comprises everything. The actual tar that is laid on the street, or the houses around it, or whatever structures that surround the street, All of this contribute to the making of a certain street in a certain area, right? So now we would look into the scope of structuralism. What is the scope of structuralism and how does it work? Yeah. Before we move on to the scope of structuralism, I want to discuss this one last point, considering I left it out in my last video as there wasn't enough time. So, see, we understood language in these terms. We saw language as constitutive, we saw it as relational, we saw it as arbitrary. Now, another distinction made by Saussure is that language could be seen in terms of langue and parole. Okay? Now, there is langue and there is parole. And how would you understand it? First of all, langue would be a particular, a system of structure, while parole would be a part of the structure. All right? So I told you right in the beginning of structuralism to imagine a wall, yeah? To imagine a wall, and then of all the bricks, that comprise the wall, one particular brick would be your literary text, while the wall itself will be the entire genre or the system of literature itself, or the system of language and literature that you are going to study the literary text in relation with, right? So imagine that brick wall and one particular brick. Now the langue would be the brick wall. That is, all the structures, all the systematic rules that govern the working of a language. All right? And parole would be, so here we have a general, sort of a very simplified a definition of langue and parole. Langue would be language as a system of a structure or a structure, and parole would be any given utterance in that language. So, for instance, if you're going to speak French or German, now a French word could be understood by a person only if he is in, if he is if he is familiar with all the structures and the syntax and the rules governing, language, the language French, the French language, right? So this particular word would be the langue, whereas, this particular word would be the parole, while all the rules that govern the working of the language to which the word belongs would be langue. Okay. So a particular remark will make sense only when we have all the rules and conventions governing the verbal behavior of that language. Now, for example, this word amma. Okay, this word we have amma would be a parole belonging to the langue of Tamil language. Okay, amma, a word, would be a parole, and it could be understood only if you are familiar with all the rules that govern the language. Not all, even if not all, to some extent you have to be familiar with the structure of Tamil to understand what that word means. So that structure of language itself would be langue for you, right? Now, the structuralist approach to langue and parole is something like this. The individual work would be parole, while the genre or the culture within which the work resides would be langue. All right? So, for instance, we have Mansfield Park. That particular literary text would be understood only when you place it in the larger structure of the genre to which it belongs. Now, what is the genre? That would be novel. All right, and if you want to understand, see, there are so many various perspectives from which you approach a text, literary text. One thing you need to keep in mind is that every text, no matter which one it is, it can be understood in isolation, as the new critics believed or practiced, as according to the practice of the new critics, or it could be understood using various lenses. It could be understood in relation to its historical aspects. It could be looked at from the biographical point of view. It could be looked at from the political perspective, or it could be looked at from a Marxist perspective, or it could be seen as through the psychological lens, psychoanalytic perspective. It's just the lens that matters. It's the lens with which you view a certain text. That's what it's about. All right. So since I haven't really prepared a PPT, or I haven't really worked on, extensively for this, I request you to bear with me for today alone. Hopefully tomorrow, or in the next video, we'll do fair justice to this, to the scope of structuralism of, yeah, from Peter Barry. I guess this is all for today. Thank you so much. Take care, stay safe. Allah Hafiz. Assalamu alaikum.